Good afternoon, good evening. Both statements are appropriate depending upon where you reside. We're back with another monthly webinar, clinically focused, doctor focused. And I don't know if anyone got a chance to read the monthly blog post, but I started it very oddly, referencing when you go to an Elton John concert, you really want to hear Goodbye Yellow Brick Road or Benny and the Jets are one of the greatest hits. And the reason the greatest hits are always coveted and played at specific concerts, that's the reason why an artist becomes famous. It's the work of the creation of theirs that resonate with people because they do something positive for them in their world. We have done so many different deep dives into body systems, mechanisms of action, specific topics, all of which have been walking a very fine line between education for education's sake, as well as education with specific context as it relates to digestive wellness, systemic wellness, probiotics, and enzymes. We're making a bit of a turn. We're going more specific and getting into education for clinical consideration's sake. Just kind of made up that statement and it works quite well because as we grow and expand as a company, more people are becoming aware of what we do. A lot of the products we have are not products that are just competitor space alternatives to other brands. We have very unique offerings. The products we have are of unmatched quality, unmatched purity, and therefore the efficacy speaks for themselves. And as Jeff mentioned, we're very excited to be launching this private label program to where you can take your personal branding, which is an evolution or an extension of you, and marry that with the top quality products that we are offering. We'll get into more details of which later on, because it's exciting, it's a lot. But in order to ring in this new celebration of the first two products that will be on private label, I thought that we would go back to our greatest hits. U.S.Enzymes, of course, is an enzyme-based brand. And as a result of doing that, I think we put something into the space that has really shaken up how powerful enzymes can be as clinical tools and highlighted things that the North American market really hasn't considered as a mainstay go-to, i.e. an enzyme as a clinical tool. So without further ado, we're going to get into an enzyme overview highlighting these two wonderful products. But before we do that, my cursor will work properly, we do have to go over a little bit of a background just because understanding what an enzyme is and how it fits into the whole mold of biochemistry is really important. When you hear enzyme, there's two things that I want everyone to think of. The first word is catalyst, the second word is protein. Why an enzyme is a specific protein, and technically our genetics code for the creations of specific enzymes that target specific areas in the body. So technically speaking, each substrate that needs to be acted upon by an enzyme works like a lock and key mechanism. It's one enzyme target for one specific molecule, and it's called a stereospecific thing, meaning it only works on a very specific active binding site. And why enzymes are so important is essentially our metabolism runs on enzymes doing what it is they do. Every body system, every biochemical reaction is an enzyme-dependent thing. And if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty details and nerd out a little bit, the names of enzymes characterize their action and therefore how they work. So, the name of an ase typically is something that breaks something down. Lactase, in this example, is an enzyme that breaks bonds of milk sugar, lactose, so our body can take that lactose and hopefully, if you're lactose intolerant, I'm sorry, there's really not a ton you can do. Hopefully get some good lactase. But for others who are not lactose intolerant, your body can convert that lactose into actual usable energy. So whatever the enzyme's ending is, and the name of the enzyme typically alludes to what it acts upon, it's actually quite a simple mechanism to understand. Why enzymes are foundational in a healthy body is in a healthy body that has energy, your physiology is able to catalyze a multitude of biochemical reactions efficiently. So basically it gets work done with using as minimal energy as possible. So enzymes are really there to catalyze these reactions, and they're there to make the reaction as efficient as possible by reducing the activation energy. So if something needs to be converted, if we were to just rely upon natural processes, it may take, I don't know, 5 years arbitrarily. An enzyme can take that 5-year reaction and turn it into something that takes fractions of a second, milliseconds. So an enzyme will interact with a substrate. It binds to form an enzyme substrate complex. Then you have a modification of that substrate, and then the new products that have been created by that enzyme's action get released, and they go into wherever they're destined to go. So if we're taking something like nattokinase, and that nattokinase is going to figure out where the fibrin in our cardiovascular system, not our connective tissue, our circulatory tissue is, the fibrin will bind, it will get cleaved, then all of a sudden that fibrin protein, which has a nefarious action in the body if left unregulated, gets disassembled and detoxified and no longer has the ability to promote the development of cardiovascular issues. The reason enzymes are so powerful is, as I said before, the increasing the rate of chemical reactions, but it also does so without compromising the substrate or creating a negative collateral response. So as a result of that, you have this homeostasis that is maintained in our physiology, because if there is a sequence of actions that require different enzymes to work as step 1, step 2, step 3, if there's a bottleneck in that process becomes compromised. As a result of that compromise, it can negatively impact physiology. Here's an example. If I eat food and I ingest carbohydrates, I want to turn the carbohydrates into that food into ATP chemical energy. So when that food gets into my cell and it transports its way into the mitochondria, we have this thing that every clinician remembered for a test but loves to forget the minute that it's done, called a Krebs cycle, which is a series of enzymatic changes of a glucose molecule to liberate ATP. If there are enzymatic issues, nutritional deficiencies, amino acid deficiencies, inhibitors like toxic metals or environmental compounds that get inside the cell, then that process gets compromised. So the ability for that enzyme to work in a sequence within the physiology yields a compromised state of health. And that's why enzymes being so critically important to our physiology is a foundational aspect of health, in my opinion. In the absence of enzyme catalysts, most biochemical reactions that we depend upon would never happen, because the only conditions that would influence that reaction would be time and potentially temperature of the environment where it takes part in. So enzymes accelerate the rate of reactions by well over a millionfold, which is incredible. And cells contain so many different enzymes that without enzymes being adequately powered up with energy, adequately fed with cofactors, specifically mineral cofactors, then the health that we covet so much wouldn't be possible and our physiology would cease to exist. So enzymes, in many ways, are the unsung heroes of our health that are not necessarily talked about or prioritized, which is why I believe personally in the Western world, in North America, we don't think of enzymes as go-to selections for clinical considerations. Because again, enzymes weren't something that we're as focused on as, say, herbs, vitamins, minerals, and various other compounds that work in the natural health world. So how do enzymes fit within the regulation and maintenance of health? This is the most important concept I've really been trying to instill in people and drill down lately. Optimal function is related to energy and adaptability. If you have an individual who has an adequate amount of energy and there's no symptoms or issues they're experiencing, then objectively and subjectively, they are expressing health. As the body becomes compromised, as the body loses its adaptability and therefore reduces its available energy, what ends up happening within the physiology is less work gets done, but more energy is utilized. So therefore, if we take that concept and relate it back to the concept of enzymes, it's kind of like what I talked about in the example of making energy. Anything that causes a disruption in the functioning of normal physiology will negatively impact enzymatic processes, how fast, efficient, and how many chemical reactions are able to take place. So as a result of our enzymatic issue, and I don't want to say deficiency because the body makes almost all the enzymes that it needs for such scenarios, but when these things become compromised, we create bottlenecks. When we create bottlenecks, we create a backlog in biochemical reactions happening at the appropriate times. And the ultimate impact of that is the cell becomes less functional as a health promoting unit within our bigger sphere of physiology. and it becomes sick. And a sick cell will become a sick tissue. A sick tissue eventually becomes a sick organ. And when a sick organ within the organ systems becomes the bottleneck, that pattern keeps repeating in a fractal way. So to me, health is the regulation of the yin and the yang of our physiologic function overall. So the key roles that enzymes play is the regulation of energy conservation and utilization. It's like a bank account. You always want to have a reserve of energy, just like you always want to have a reserve of money, just in case something happens. Enzymes are absolutely critical with the regulation of what I'm going to highlight today, the anabolic and catabolic balance within the body. There's always a buildup and a breakdown. Cells are always giving birth and cells are always dying. It is the speed at which those two processes happen in relation to each other that determines how long we live, how healthfully long we live, and ultimately how well our tissues function. And within that is the regulation of the biotransformation of key compounds. So many people talk about things like a genetic MTHFR gene, which is really just an enzymatic inefficiency of creating methylfolate, which the body needs for the methylation process, from the folinic acid that we eat in green food vegetables. So it's something as powerful as that, yet as simple as that, can have a negative consequence when it comes to how the entirety of our physiology can fit itself together and adequately maintain health. So now that we have a bit of a background on enzymes, and if anyone has questions, by all means, stay on after the lecture is done and we can get into some specific Q&A. I think it's important to now switch focus to the clinical context of enzymes. And if anyone's interested, you can actually pop it in the chat. I would like to know what enzyme anyone thinks this is, and the winner gets a special prize that Jeff Brubkin will announce at the end of the lecture. So going back to the concept of anabolic and catabolic balance. This is a foundational concept within health. Catabolism is breakdown, anabolism is buildup. And fundamentally, our cells and our tissues do this chronically, and it's why we need to eat food, drink water, breathe oxygen, is simply so our physiology can maintain itself. There's a program within our cells and our tissues that ultimately know what to do. That's why, you know, as your liver cells divide, at some point in your life, your liver cells never become a neuron. And it's why your skin cells never become a muscle cell, because there is a biological program and code within the system. And it is this balance ultimately that determines where the health of someone ultimately goes, which is why I do think of it as a yin and a yang. It's like a perfect scale of balance. Catabolism can be beneficial for us. What I mean by that is when we eat food, it is a catabolic process. If we cannot properly catabolize the large molecules of food into small molecules, then our body can absorb them and then take those small molecules and properly assemble them in an anabolic process to make new tissue. That is where a digestive enzyme fits in, and we'll go into those clinical specifics very soon. Conversely, if we do not want to experience excessive catabolism of our physiology, an example of this is when someone loses a lot of muscle mass and starts to put on body fat as excessive weight. Their system is excessively catabolic because they're wasting their healthy tissue, but they're building excessive energy stores that their body is not yet vibrant enough and metabolically powerful enough to burn rather than store. So if we have things like chronic inflammation, excessive toxic burden, anything that compromises how well our physiology functions, we have an anabolic deficiency because we have excessive catabolic activity in the form of various pro-inflammatory and immune-mediated scenarios. Again, I will go into this a little bit more in depth coming up, but I wanted to set the tone to understand that this interplay between physiology is fundamentally and foundationally important for understanding the difference between health and disease, but knowing where to use specific enzymes to insert them in a process that may be compromised is even more important, because when someone's in front of you as a client, you need to do something for what it is they're coming to you for. So understanding the scope and the context of use, what an enzyme does that no other natural health product or supplement does is it is the true catalyst for energy conservation in the body. As we examined before, if you have an imbalance in biochemical reactions in the body, then the internal enzymatic process is slowed down. But you can use external enzyme support to help remedy a potential issue that may be causing this problem. An example is, looking at how nattokinase interacts with the cardiovascular system. The purpose of our cardiovascular system is essentially to pump oxygenated blood around the body, deliver that oxygen to tissues so it can make energy in the presence of the calories from the food we eat. If the blood is not able to flow optimally, if there is too much platelet aggregation, if there is an excessive buildup of fibrin protein and there's narrowing of the arteries, then that oxygenated blood does not get delivered. So all the enzymatic processes that are dependent upon oxygen being present to make energy basically become compromised, and our cells switch to an anaerobic metabolism, which is an energy poor process. It's a backup, it's a secondary process. So if we know that we want to restore energy, because in my opinion, all disease is an energy problem, if we use nattokinase at an appropriate dose for the appropriate person over an appropriate period of time, then its chemical activity within the cardiovascular system in the bloodstream can help restore the problem that we're experiencing that we call cardiovascular disease or cardiovascular related issues, which fundamentally is an energy problem at the end of the day. So enzymes can be categorized in a multitude of ways depending upon how you want to use them. The example I just used is what I would call a direct target tool. I know the target that I want to focus on. I know there's an enzyme that exists that targets that specifically, so it's going to be my clinical go-to. But let's use that same person. If they have developed cardiovascular disease, it's fair to assume that's not the only thing they're suffering from. People with cardiovascular disease may have type 2 diabetes, may have metabolic syndrome, and we know the correlation of research between what goes on in the microbiome and the cardiovascular system and the entire metabolism in general. So if I'm helping that person with cardiovascular disease target something specifically with nattokinase, well, if they're having gut issues, might I want to use an enzyme as a clinical tool that creates a bridge between the conditions? Because if I know dysbiosis leads to inflammation, and inflammation can be something that comes from a leaky gut-like scenario, then maybe if I improve the digestive process and I help the client's gut, and I give them a good probiotic as a sidebar, but if I do that, maybe that might work in synergy with my directly targeted tool of nattokinase. Or if I want to be a little bit more holistic in my examination, maybe I'll figure out some other things that work really well in the cardiovascular system, like magnesium threonate and like hawthorn. So I can now use an enzyme as a synergistic tool that I might not have considered before, because my knowledge of enzymes as they relate to clinical conditions is something that I don't necessarily have familiarity with. And then there's the wonderful aspect about using an enzyme when there's nothing wrong. Because other than someone who's on a blood thinner, and generally speaking, when you're on a blood thinner, you're already at a problem stage, you can use systemic enzymes as preventative tools or general health tools as a way to prevent issues from coming on. Because to be quite honest with you, the quality of the food we eat, the pace of life we live nowadays, the quality of the sleep we have, all of those things are energy takers. They're not energy givers anyway, because our environment is increasingly stressful that we're subjected to. But because we call it our normal, the insidious development of illness and disease is something that eludes most people because they don't do anything until it's too late and they have to react. So using an enzyme as a preventative general health tool is another thing that you can do in conjunction with various other supplements. So for me, it's about the intention, the clinical proficiency of the professional, what their specialty is and how they like to build protocols, which ultimately determines the use, most importantly, the outcome for the patient. So distinguishing the use of enzymes is really important. Digestive enzymes fundamentally are one of the go-to supplements that I think before all else has no negative consequence. It would be the first thing that I would choose for the average person, even if they were healthy, because every now and again, we tend to abuse our GI systems. If anyone's ever eaten a blooming onion before, you know exactly what I mean. But a digestive enzyme is useful under all conditions where there's a malnourishment or a deficiency, or if there is already a state of hypofunctioning within the GI system. While you figure out why that hypofunctioning scenario has manifested, until you can resolve it, you have to do something to bridge the gap and help the person in the in-between. So digestive enzymes are always in a digestive specific context. Very easy connection to make. Systemic enzymes are much more broad stroke and broad spectrum. because they become useful on empty stomach conditions. If you use a systemic enzyme in the presence of food, it becomes a very expensive glorified digestive enzyme for protein. But when it's used appropriately under conditions of chronic inflammation or pro-inflammatory stimuli mediated via the immune system, then the systemic enzyme is a fantastic tool. And knowing that we have different enzymes that target different body systems with quite robust research behind them, you can use these two things in tandem and pairing them really well with probiotics to use our master philosophy as a starting point, because the little catchphrase that I came up with is catabolism by mechanism, because most enzymes we're using are breaking things down from a supplemental perspective, but you're doing so to support anabolism metabolically. And as I mentioned before, if we can break our food down and increase the adequacy of our nourishment, and we can also break down pro-inflammatory and pro-immune stimulants that may be residing in our bodies for a variety of reasons, we can increase anabolism, we can increase vitality, and thus we can increase health and energy. So now we're going to get into DigestZyme, and this is also information that pertains to DigestZyme Plus. I'm just highlighting DigestZyme here because they're the same product at different doses, essentially. Same formulation, just one is double potency in terms of its dose. We've talked about digestion time and time again, and it really is the foundational crux of not only the master philosophy, which is the product usage guide, but where I feel most people should start with their clients, because most things either connect to or stem from a digestive issue. If the digestive process isn't robust, then systemic inflammation is just a matter of when. This is something that I've really realized clinically, and the validation of that statement keeps getting reiterated with the different axes that research is elucidating that connect to the gut-brain axes, the gut-lung, the gut-heart, the gut-skin. The thing that ends up being manifested in all these axes is excessive immune activity causing some sort of acute and/or chronic inflammation. And knowing that the digestive system is the impetus to this, it's not simply knowing that digestion in and of itself is super important. It's knowing that how well someone's digestive system works is also a proxy for how well their physiology is interconnected. Because the digestive system is dependent upon organs, which have to have enough energy to have proper exocrine output, meaning your stomach needs to be able to make enough hydrochloric acid, your pancreas needs to be able to make enough enzymes, gallbladder enough bile, but you also need to have a really strongly functioning vagus nerve, so your autonomic nervous system can regulate your enteric nervous system, which influences the speed of how things move through your digestive system in the tube, but also the integrity of your tight junctions in your digestive system and the absorptive capacity of the small intestine, because we very, very easily assume that food eaten means food digested, which means food absorbed. If you're seeing stuff when you go to the bathroom on the other end, it means you're not absorbing your food properly. If you are experiencing any sort of symptom, be it upper, lower GI, distension, bloating, production of gas, pain, those things are signs that your digestive system is trying to tell you that something's not working well. So the consequences are actually worse than the symptoms themselves. If you take a look at this diagram, this is just the complexity of protein digestion. So as we eat food, our nervous system starts to tell all the organs of digestion to secrete their zymogens, which are inactive enzymes. Then we have to have an activation of those enzymes at each appropriate step that focus on the specific type of macronutrient. In this case, you can see that there are different protein digesting enzymes that liberate different amino acids from the food we eat at different stages of the digestive process. As you get all the way down to the brush border, that's the epithelial lining of the small intestine, that's when we need to make sure that every step in the above process is adequately complete so we can absorb these single amino acids and not allow too many undigested protein molecules to get into the colon, so that creates a problem. B, too many undigested protein molecules to fall through the gap junctions and get into our bloodstream, because that causes a different problem. So this process is essential for the maintenance of health, and thus the formulation of a digestive enzyme supplement has to consider all of these things in process. So what does it have to have? Well, it has to have a complement of enzymes that are able to work at the various levels of the digestive process, from the initial chewing of the food all the way to the absorption of food in the small intestine. Those enzymes need to have a pH range of stability, because the pH process, or the pH level in the digestive process rather, changes dramatically based upon where it is, and also where the enzymes have to be most active to do their work. Enzymes have to be covering all macronutrients. So protein digestion is different from fat digestion, is different from carbohydrate digestion. And when looking at all of these enzymes, we have to understand that enzymes need cofactors, and that's what we do differently. Using the Astrozyme trace mineral supplement, which provides the necessary activation molecule for the enzymes to do work, maximizes the amount of work that those enzymes can do in breaking down your food. And looking at a label of a digestive enzyme, you might see all of these different enzymes that end with A's at the end of it. It's really good to know that each enzyme has a specific function, and oftentimes why a digestive enzyme can be very beneficial for someone outside digesting protein, carbs, and fats is a lot of the different fibers have enzymes in a digestive enzyme formula that can actually interact with them to make it less agitating or irritating on someone's gut. Certain people who have very sensitive issues, if they have cruciferous vegetables, they have high fiber fruits, it's not that the food is bad for them, it's their system is either lacking in its ability to break it down, or because of some scenario of enzyme insufficiency, they need a little more assistance. If you think about this, and this is an incredible statistic, each meal under normal physiologic conditions, a pancreas will create 480,000 to 960,000 lipase units per meal, and an average is in the middle. A 10% reduction, so that's still a huge number, is when you start to experience what's called steatosis, which is undigested fats are getting into the stool, and as you're going to the restroom and having a bowel movement, you have consequences of steatotic stool, which is caused by oily slicks in the water and floating stools on the top. So what does that mean for you? It means you're not properly digesting your fats, which means your body's going to have energy issues, and fat soluble vitamins like vitamin A, vitamin E, vitamin D, and K are likely going to become deficient in the long term, because there's a very strong feedback system here between hormones from the enteric nervous system signaling the organs of digestion, and the organs of digestion doing the proper work to secrete the necessary secretions for the breakdown of all the food that we eat. And this process of catabolic, activity or catabolism is at every level of digestion. We have to understand that knowing the big to small process of molecule breakdown allows us to know that if there's any upstream consequences that our clients are experiencing, then there's going to be downstream problems as a result of the fact that we can't break our food down. So by understanding this, where it happens in the digestive system, within the process itself, it allows you to better understand why digestive enzyme formulas are constructed exactly as they are. So from a clinical consideration, why does this matter to you and your clients? What are the consequences of improper protein digestion? Well, microbes also have enzymes. And as protein, which is not absorbed properly in the small intestine, gets into the large intestine, the interaction between the microbes that live in our gut and the enzymes that they secrete interacting with the proteins that we did not absorb create things like methane, hydrogen sulfide, hydrogen gases, which alter the state of our microbiome, can cause some degree of immune suppression, and ultimately generate the potential for dysbiosis because it changes the internal environment and the pH in the colon. Improper carbohydrate digestion promotes fermentation of carbohydrates. So basically, it's like the equivalent of humans eating junk food for your microbes. You can overly feed certain populations of microbes, which when in normal populations are commensal bacteria, but when overgrown become pathogens. So this is another path of dysbiosis. Improper fat digestion, as I mentioned, leads to steatosis, potential nutritional and digestive deficiencies. All of these things promise a state of dysbiosis. And once dysbiosis is present, we've talked about this, ad nauseum at this point, dysbiosis leads to a pro-inflammatory microbiome phenotype, chronic immune activation, the onset of leaky gut, the compromisation of detoxification pathways, as a result of all the biochemical activity and pro-inflammatory cytokines that are being created, all because our system became compromised. So when taking something like Digestzyme or Digestzyme Plus, generally speaking, Digestzyme Plus, I would say for people who are larger physically and who are consuming more food, just because it's a more efficient use of the enzyme. And a therapeutic dose could simply be a capsule at every major meal. Again, this is not the therapeutic dose, it's an option. A clinical supporting dose, this is what I would use when someone wasn't extremely compromised, but they experienced some digestive disturbances here and there. Simply use a capsule daily with the biggest meal. General support dose, if someone suspects a food is challenging for them to tolerate, or if they're going through periods of high stress, there is no consequence with taking a digestive enzyme to give your body an energetic break from helping to break its own food down. And I operate with the insurance policy. If I'm going out for dinner, I don't know who's preparing the food, I don't necessarily know what kinds of oils, herbs, and spices and sauces are being used, I have a Digestzyme Plus in my pocket. I'm that guy who takes it out in the middle of dinner when no one's looking, and I just pop it in and I get on with my dinner. So, it's a reason when you rent a car, you get an insurance policy. Hopefully, you do things, nothing of negative consequence happens, you go about your business. So this is how I would frame using something like a digestive enzyme, given the scope of who we're talking about and what it is they need. Shifting gears to systemic enzymes, Therazyme is our full spectrum, broad spectrum systemic enzyme blend. And Therazyme really shines in its ability to help the immune system resolve the stimuli from systemic inflammation. We have to understand that systemic inflammation is an appropriate response in the body's attempt to heal itself. It is not a mistake by the body. The role of the immune system is to intervene with anything that causes an inflammatory response and use the inflammation to knock out the threat. The problem becomes when the chronic inflammation is being fed into the body because the stimuli is unable to be resolved. This is where an enzyme comes in, because what an enzyme does is it helps the immune system by providing a specific action at a specific target to help the immune system resolve the potential issue it's experiencing, and B, it takes the energetic burden off of the immune system by targeting things like foreign proteins, antigen complexes, endotoxins, which are toxins created from things leaking into from our digestive system into our small intestines, things like biofilms. And the cool thing that I learned recently is this is a term, geo-targeting capabilities. This is how specific enzymes know where to go in the body given a certain circumstance. They have this ability to geographically target and be drawn to where the white blood cell activity of specificity is being acted upon by the body protein that the enzyme wants to break down. So what that means practically is if you take a serrapeptidase and you have a torn ligament or a torn piece of cartilage, the serrapeptidase will be attracted to that specific site of inflammation. If you take a lumbar kinase and you have an aggregation of protein buildup in the plaque in your arteries, that's where that specific enzyme will geo-target. Proteases are actually ubiquitous within our system. There are thousands of different proteases, and typically they're either endoproteases, which are protein digesting enzymes inside the cell, or exoenzymes, which are protein digesting enzymes that float around in general circulation within body systems. So supplemental systemic enzymes are exoenzymes because we're taking them internally and they're getting through the digestive lining and being attracted to the specific protein substrate they want to break down. I'll let you guys have these slides, but for anyone's interest, when it comes to proteases, there are 4 specific types of proteases that are determined by the amino acid sequencing and how they break down the proteins by targeting the specific amino acid in the chain and essentially unraveling them in the process of breaking them down, making them essentially no longer threatening and null and void to the body. So another question that you can pop in the chat, what enzyme is this here? Because without proteases helping to regulate the anabolic catabolic balance of our body, the ability for our metabolism, regulatory function of all tissues becomes compromised. When the body is under threat by pro-inflammatory stress, it's likely to assume also that the ability to make adequate amounts of proteases to help deal with the internal issues becomes compromised. So by using external supplemental proteases, not only are we helping with this geo-targeting immune activation problem, but if we're energetically compromised in the first place, we may be deficient in the very things our body is needing. So all the more reason to look at these things as something that can be used on a variety of different levels, including just general health and support to keep those specific body systems healthy. When designing a systemic enzyme, there are some considerations because with something like Therazyme, we're casting a wide a net as possible. So the pH considerations matter. Is it an acid protease? Is it a neutral or an alkaline protease? Because different situations in the body and different specific sites of the body have different pH levels depending upon what's going on. We also consider body system specificity. So specific enzymes, as I say, have general targets, or others are more general circulatory in their nature, and they support things that may be floating around in the bloodstream rather than a specific organ or tissue. The mode of absorption, transport, and action, that's a question we get a lot, which I'm going to talk about. And as a result of its broad spectrum formula, Therazyme creates a true systemic effect in the body. But if someone wants something far more therapeutic at its target, you can buy individual high-dose nattokinase, serrapeptidase, C-Pros-S, if the client condition calls for it. So the body's way of taking these proteins and getting them into the body is rather interesting because you might think, well, if I'm taking a protein, why doesn't my body digest the protein that is the enzyme? Well, A, because there is no specific enzyme that is meant for digesting these protein-based enzymes. But two, the body seems to have a knowledge and intelligence when it comes to recognizing these molecules or these proteins as being something very useful or very beneficial. So under the proper conditions of empty stomach, we can take systemic proteases and they can be transported directly across the epithelial lining fully intact. When they have done so, that means they're going to get directly into the bloodstream, but they themselves are likely not able to circulate on their own. They need to have some sort of a carrier or a chaperone. And there's this thing called the alpha-2 macroglobulin. This is probably going to be the longest word combination I say all day, but it's essentially a macroglobulin is like a protein carrier that has the ability to absorb and transport the systemic protease, which then gets absorbed by a white blood cell. So it's almost like a Russian doll scenario where a smaller thing pops out of a smaller thing. These proteases are transported by these specific molecules that hitch a ride with the white blood cells that are being attracted to the specific site of need. I think this is an incredible process in terms of not only someone actually elucidated it, but the body's infinite intelligence for the ability to help itself heal and regenerate is really all the body wants to do. So the key here in understanding is that this will happen as long as someone is taking a systemic protease, an empty stomach enzyme. One time is not going to do anything. This has to be a regular occurrence because the body will resolve that inflammatory issue given enough time under the right circumstances, providing there's enough energy. And knowing that systemic proteases help not only reduce the energetic burden on the immune system, when the immune system is no longer needed to be so vigilant, then energy can go back to the tissue that's being destroyed to start the regeneration process and resolve the chronic inflammation. So clinically speaking, Therazyme works on a multitude of different levels and a multitude of different body systems. You have general circulatory general circulatory support, things like floating foreign particles, antigen antibody complexes, pro-inflammatory compounds, and toxic materials that may be in circulatory systems. This is what the papain, the bromelain, the protease, and the peptidases do. They're non-specific protein-degrading enzymes. We have cardiovascular support with nattokinase. The respiratory mucosa has an affinity as to what C-Pros-S does, breaking up mucolytic proteins in the respiratory lining. And serrapeptidase typically has the most affinity for necrotic tissue in the body, but it also seems to be able to help, break up biofilms as the C-Pros, possibly natto as well. So this is when I say it's a wide cast net, a true systemic effect is created by Therazyme because it's operating in so many different body systems at the same time. When it comes to therapeutic dosing for Therazyme, I mean, I've heard as high as 8 a day for some people. I know Troy, the creator of U.S.Enzymes, was using an incredibly high dose when he was climbing Mount Everest. I don't know if you guys plan to do that, but you may want to think about doing 8 a day if you're doing something like going up to where there is no oxygen. But I think a therapeutic dose of Therazyme is likely safe at 3 capsules a day for a defined period of time. Hopefully, in that duration, you will see the clinical issue that the person is suffering with start to show signs of improvement. Clinically supporting dose, this is where you can start to taper down because I've heard of multiple people needing 3 to 6 months of regular enzyme supplementation to really move the needle on experiencing some symptoms that just demonstrate changes happening in the physiology. You know, there was one woman who was in a car accident. She experienced some pretty bad side effects or after effects from the accident. And it wasn't until like the 3 month mark, and Jeff can correct me at the end of the webinar, that she started really smelling like acid ammonia detox in her urine because it took that long for the enzymes to start doing their job. So you can taper down for a defined term as well. And a general support dose, something that I like to do is taking 1, possibly 2 enzymes daily if you're a highly active person or you're under, intensive periods of physical stress, or if you fly a lot, because flying not only is very pro-coagulating of the blood, but changing time zones and disrupting the body's natural biorhythms and regulations, anything that you can do to help the body conserve energy and recover and get back to homeostasis faster will always be beneficial. And the research on how some of these enzymes work is starting to come out and become more mainstay. Jeff Thurston is digging up stuff that I get messaged to me on a regular weekly basis, so I appreciate that. But just knowing how some of the mechanisms of action work here, looking at serrapeptidase, what serrapeptidase does in the case of non-specific general inflammation in the cell is it can inhibit the cyclooxygenase enzymes, which upregulate pro-inflammatory cytokines to stimulate the NF-kappa B within the cell, going to a pro-inflammatory stimuli. Nattokinase has the ability to break down fibrin and degrade not only the fibrin itself, but to activate the body's own pro-fibrin degrading enzymes. So you get a 2-for-1 benefit when using nattokinase in terms of how it improves and enhances the health of the circulatory system. And the last thing I do want to talk about, and Jeff mentioned at the beginning, personal branding is becoming something that is ever increasingly popular in the health industry because people like to have an extension of them in everything that it is they do. And there was a long period of time that we were asked if we do any private labeling, can we manufacture for other people? Well, ask and ye shall receive. The exact formulations that we have are able to be created with your specific branding, name, logo, and everything on there. And for the month of June, which is what we're doing to kick it off, there's a 20% off private label for the month. So you get your personal branding with a guaranteed U.S.Enzymes quality, which comes with the unmatched product purity and efficacy, because where we source our enzymes from, the quality is second to none. And it's reflected in the quality and also the price. So if you are interested, you can directly reach out to the office, or even better, reach out to your rep directly because they have all the necessary information. We're launching this program with these 2 products that we've been talking about, so Digeszyme and Therazyme, but we're also going to be able to get into some of the probiotics towards mid-2024. So if you do have specific questions, again, you can pop on the chat after the webinar is done, or you can reach out to your reps to get more information. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that was enjoyable. We went back to the greatest hits. It's kind of fun talking about things that we do uniquely, and I'm biased in saying this, but hopefully better than everyone else. And again, I thank you for being part of this. We have another really awesome webinar coming next month. And if you have any questions, please feel free to jump on.